I stood in the cemetery as they lowered my mom into the ground. Elizabeth Parker, the woman who loved me more than anyone else in this world, gone too soon at 57. Breast cancer took her away from us after an agonizing 6-month battle. What hurt even more than watching her coffin disappear was seeing my father Richard standing there without shedding a single tear. After the service, he pulled me aside with news that made my blood run cold. He was marrying his secretary Sandra tomorrow. Right away. The way they exchanged glances told me everything I needed to know about their relationship while my mother was still alive. Before I continue this heartbreaking story, let me know where you are watching from, and hit subscribe to make sure you do not miss the shocking conclusion to this tale of betrayal, justice, and the power of a mother who protected her son, even.com. After death. Growing up in our suburban Boston home, I never imagined my perfect family would someday shatter into pieces. My childhood was filled with warmth and love, the kind most people only dream about. My mom, Elizabeth, was a dedicated high school English teacher who somehow always managed to put our family first, despite her demanding job. My father, Richard, built his real estate company from the ground up, turning it into one of the most successful firms in Massachusetts. Together, they created a stable, loving environment for me. I remember our summer vacations to Cape Cod, where we would spend days building sandcastles and evenings playing board games. Sunday dinners were sacred in our house, with my mother preparing elaborate meals that brought us all together at the end of each week. My parents attended every school, played every baseball game, and celebrated every achievement, no matter how small. My bond with my mother was particularly special. Elizabeth had a gentle wisdom about her that made everyone gravitate toward her, but I was the fortunate one who got to call her Mom. She taught me about integrity, loyalty, and kindness, not through lectures, but through her daily actions. When I struggled with math in 9th grade, she sat with me every night until the concepts clicked. When I was bullied in 7th grade, she taught me how to stand up for myself while remaining compassionate toward others. It was my mother who encouraged my interest in architecture. She noticed how I would spend hours building elaborate structures with my Lego sets and later sketching buildings in my notebook. She bought me architecture books, took me to visit famous buildings whenever we traveled, and never once suggested I should pursue something more practical. Thanks to her unwavering support, I graduated from Cornell with my architecture degree and landed a job at a prestigious firm in Boston. My parents had what I believed was the perfect marriage. They met at Boston University, fell in love over discussions about literature and dreams, and married after graduation. In their early years, they struggled financially, as my father launched his business, and my mother began teaching, but they always faced challenges as a team. They respected each other, supported each other, and most importantly, they truly seemed to enjoy each other. At least that was what I always thought. The first signs that something was changing came about 3 years ago. My father started coming home later and later, claiming his growing business demanded more of his time. His weekend golf games became more frequent, and suddenly there were business trips that took him away for days. My mother never questioned him. She trusted him completely, often defending his absence when I would make comments about him missing important family events. Then Sandra entered the picture. At 32, she was nearly 25 years younger than my father. With her perfect blonde hair, designer clothes, and ambitious attitude, she became my father Richard's executive assistant. Whenever I visited the office, she was always hovering around him, finding excuses to touch his arm or lean in close when showing him documents. I noticed it, but convinced myself I was being paranoid. My father would never betray my mother, especially not with someone so obviously calculating. I did notice my father becoming more secretive with his phone, taking calls in another room and sometimes texting late into the night. Once, when I borrowed his phone to make a call because mine had died, a text message notification popped up from Sandra saying she missed him already. I mentioned it casually to my mother, but she just smiled and said Sandra was probably just being a dedicated employee. Her faith in my father was unshakable. Looking back, I wish I had paid more attention to these warning signs. I wish I had confronted my father earlier, or somehow protected my mother from what was coming. But like her, I wanted to believe in the goodness of the man we both loved. The day my mother was diagnosed with stage 4 breast cancer remains the darkest day of my life. What had started as a routine mammogram ended with devastating news. The cancer had already spread to her bones and liver. The doctors gave her a year at most, though they offered treatments that might extend her time or improve her quality of life. The shock hit our family like a tsunami. I remember sitting in the doctor's office watching my mother's face as she received the news. She did not cry or break down. Instead, she nodded, thoughtfully, asked practical questions about treatment options, and then reached out to hold my hand and my father's. Even facing her own mortality, she was thinking about comforting us. In those first few weeks, my father seemed appropriately devastated. He accompanied her to appointments, researched experimental treatments, and even talked about taking time off to care for her. I temporarily relocated back to my childhood home to help putting my architecture projects on hold and working remotely when possible. We created a united front to support Mom through this battle. But as the months wore on, and the chemotherapy took its toll on my mother, my father's attentiveness began to wane. The business emergencies became more frequent. The late nights at the office multiplied. He started missing important doctor appointments, claiming conflicts he could not reschedule. Mom never complained, always making excuses for him, and insisting he needed to keep the business running smoothly to maintain their insurance coverage. I took on more and more of her care. I drove her to chemo appointments, held her hair back when she was sick, and sat beside her bed reading her favorite books when she was too weak to hold them herself. Where was my father during these moments? Working late on business trips, handling important client meetings. Or at least, that was what he claimed. My suspicions about Sandra and my father transformed into certainty on a rainy Tuesday evening. I had taken Mom to a particularly difficult treatment session, and she was resting at home. I decided to pick up dinner from her favorite Italian restaurant across town. As I waited for our takeout order, I glanced toward the back of the restaurant and froze. There, in a secluded corner booth, sat my father and Sandra. They were not discussing business. His hand covered hers on the table, and she was leaning forward, laughing at something he said, with an intimacy that made my stomach turn. When he leaned over to kiss her, I nearly knocked over a waiter in my haste to leave before they spotted me. The evidence continued to mount. Once, while helping my father find some insurance documents in his home office, I accidentally knocked his jacket from the back of his chair. His phone fell out, and when I picked it up, a message from Sandra illuminated the screen. "Last night was amazing. I cannot wait until she is gone, and we can be together properly." The rage I felt in that moment was unlike anything I had experienced before. I wanted to smash the phone, confront my father, tell my mother everything. But then I thought about her already fighting the hardest battle of her life. Would knowing about this betrayal help her, or just add to her suffering? I decided to confront my father first. That confrontation happened later that night. When he returned home, I asked to speak with him privately in his study. Without revealing how I knew, I asked him point-blank about his relationship with Sandra. He denied it at first, but when I mentioned the text messages, his demeanor changed completely. He admitted to the affair, but begged me not to tell my mother. It would kill her faster, he argued. The stress would undermine her already fragile health. He promised he would end things with Sandra, focus on Mom during her remaining time, and make things right. He cried as he claimed to still love my mother, saying he had just been weak and overwhelmed by the impending loss. I wanted to believe him, to find some way to preserve what little family cohesion we had left. Against my better judgment, I agreed to keep his secret on the condition that he end the affair immediately and be present for Mom. He agreed readily, appearing genuinely remorseful. What a fool I was to believe him. As the weeks passed, Mom's condition deteriorated rapidly. The cancer was aggressive, and her body was tired from fighting. She began to spend most of her time in a hospital bed we had set up in the living room, wanting to remain in the heart of the home she loved, rather than in a sterile hospital. Throughout this time, my father maintained the appearance of a devoted husband when others were around, but I noticed his absences were still frequent, his excuses still flimsy. What I did not know then was that my mother was more perceptive than either of us gave her credit for. Despite her weakened state, she was making plans of her own. I later learned she had been writing letters to our family lawyer, making changes to her will, and having private conversations with Father Thomas, the priest, who had been our family's spiritual guide for decades. She was preparing for what would come, after she was gone, protecting me in ways I could not yet understand. The end came on a quiet Sunday morning in April. I was sitting beside my mother's bed, reading aloud from Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice, her favorite novel. She had been drifting in and out of consciousness for days, but she squeezed my hand weakly and whispered, "The truth will come to light, my sweet boy. Remember that I love you more than anything in this world." Those were her last words. She slipped away peacefully a few minutes later, while I held her hand and told her how much I loved her. My father was not there, having left early that morning, for what he claimed was an emergency at the office. He did not answer his phone when I called to tell him his wife, of 35 years, was dying. He arrived at the hospital an hour after she passed, his eyes red but dry. I would later wonder if those eyes were red from crying or from something else entirely. The funeral was held 3 days later. The church was packed with my mother's former students, colleagues, friends, and family members. So many people stood to share stories about how Elizabeth had touched their lives, how she had made the world better just by being in it. Through it all, my father sat stoically in the front row, occasionally dabbing at dry eyes with a handkerchief. I sat beside him, genuine tears streaming down my face, feeling more alone than I ever had, despite being surrounded by people who loved my mother. Sandra attended the funeral, sitting near the back and introducing herself as my father's executive assistant. When people asked who she was, I noticed how she kept glancing at my father, how she wore a dress that seemed inappropriately tight for a funeral, how she did not shed a single tear for the woman whose husband she had been sleeping with. The sight of her made me physically ill. After the burial, we held a reception at my parents' home. Friends and family brought food, shared more memories, and offered support. I was standing in the kitchen taking a moment alone when I heard my father tapping a glass in the living room to get everyone's attention. Curious, I moved to the doorway, just in time to hear the most shocking announcement of my life. "I know this might seem sudden to all of you." He began, his arm suddenly around Sandra's waist, pulling her close. "But life is short, as we have all been painfully reminded. Elizabeth would want me to find happiness again. Sandra and I have been growing close over these past difficult months, and we have decided not to wait any longer to formalize our commitment to each other. We will be getting married tomorrow, in a small ceremony." The room fell silent. I could see the shock and disgust on the faces of our family friends. My mother's sister Patricia stood up and walked out without a word. Our elderly neighbor, Mrs. Johnson, muttered "shameful" under her breath. And then Sandra spoke with a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "I have waited long enough," she said, flashing a diamond ring that I would later learn had belonged to my grandmother. "Richard and I are ready to start our life together." I felt like I had been struck by lightning. My father was marrying his mistress the day after my mother's funeral. The woman he had been cheating with, while my mother battled cancer, was now standing in my mother's home, wearing my grandmother's ring, announcing her intention to take my mother's place. The betrayal was so complete, so cruel, that I could not even find words to express my outrage. What happened next was even more surreal. My father announced that Father Thomas had agreed to perform the ceremony the following day, at our family home, the same priest who had just buried my mother. When I looked at Father Thomas, I expected to see reluctance or discomfort, but instead I saw something that looked almost like anticipation. He caught my eye and gave me the slightest of nods, as if trying to communicate something I could not yet understand. The next day arrived with a sense of unreality. My father had transformed the living room into a makeshift wedding venue, removing all photos of my mother in the process. A few of his business associates attended, people who had not even been at the funeral. Sandra's friends, a group of women as superficial as she was, giggled and drank champagne in the kitchen. I had initially refused to attend, but my father insisted I be there as a witness. Something about legal requirements, he claimed, though. I suspected he just wanted to cement his victory over my mother's memory by having her son present. Father Thomas arrived looking solemn but determined. He carried his Bible and a leather portfolio that seemed unusually bulky. The ceremony began with minimal fanfare. Sandra wore a white dress that was more appropriate for a cocktail party than a wedding, and my father wore a new suit I had never seen before. They stood before Father Thomas, exchanging smug glances as he began the ceremony. "We are gathered here today to join Richard and Sandra in holy matrimony. Father Thomas began, his voice carrying more authority than I had expected. Before we proceed with the vows, I have been entrusted with an important duty that must be fulfilled. My father looked confused. This was not part of the standard wedding ceremony, and definitely not something he and Sandra had planned. Before anyone could object, Father Thomas opened his portfolio and removed an envelope sealed with wax. Elizabeth Parker came to me 3 months ago, he announced to the stunned room. She asked me to hold this document and to read it aloud at a specific time should certain events come to pass. That time is now. Sandra's face drained of color. My father took a step backward, reaching for the back of a chair to steady himself. Father Thomas broke the seal and began to read what I would soon learn was my mother's second will, one that my father knew nothing about. I, Elizabeth Ann Parker, being of sound mind, do hereby declare this to be an addendum to my last will and testament, Father Thomas read. If you are hearing this document being read aloud, it means that my husband Richard has confirmed my worst suspicions by pursuing a relationship with his assistant Sandra Mills following my death. The room was dead silent now. Sandra's friends had stopped giggling. My father's business associates looked uncomfortable, and I, for the first time since my mother's diagnosis, felt something other than grief. I felt the stirrings of justice. Father Thomas continued reading my mother's words. For the past year, I have been aware of my husband's infidelity. While battling cancer, I also hired a private investigator who documented their affair in detail. More disturbingly, this investigation uncovered evidence that Richard and Sandra have been embezzling funds from our company, falsifying documents, and engaging in tax fraud. All evidence has been provided to the authorities, with instructions to act upon my death. My father made a strangled noise. Sandra backed away from him as if he had suddenly become toxic. Father Thomas kept reading, his voice steady and clear. I have transferred 70% of my personal assets into a trust for my son, Arturo. The remaining 30%, along with my shares in the company, would normally go to my husband, but given the circumstances, these assets will be held in escrow, pending the outcome of the criminal investigation I have initiated. I did not confront Richard with this information while I lived, because I wanted peace in my final days. But I could not leave this world without ensuring justice would follow. What happened next was chaos. Sandra turned on my father, screaming that he had promised her millions, that she would not go down for crimes that were his idea. My father lunged for the document in Father Thomas's hands, as if destroying it would somehow undo the wheels that had been set in motion. And through it all, I stood watching a strange calm settling over me, as I realized my mother had known everything and had protected me even from beyond the grave. You knew about this, did not you? My father accused, pointing a shaking finger at me. You and your mother plotted against me. No, Dad, I said quietly. I had no idea. But it looks like Mom knew you better than either of us thought. It was at that moment that the doorbell rang. Father Thomas opened the door to reveal 2 police officers and a woman in a suit, who identified herself as an agent from the IRS Criminal Investigation Division. They had warrants for both my father and Sandra. Richard Parker and Sandra Mills, you are under arrest for tax evasion, wire fraud, and embezzlement. The officer announced, reading them their rights, as Sandra collapsed into dramatic sobs, and my father stood in stunned silence. I stepped forward then, finally finding my voice. Actually, officers, I have something to add, I said. I have been working with the family lawyer this past week. We have uncovered additional evidence of funds being diverted to offshore accounts. It is all documented and ready for your investigation. This was only partially true. I had indeed met with our lawyer after finding my father's phone messages, but we had just begun to explore the legal implications of his affair. The rest was a bluff, but it worked exactly as I had hoped. Sandra immediately turned on my father. It was all his idea, she cried, mascara streaming down her face. He told me no one would ever find out. He said once his wife was dead, we would take the money and move to the Cayman Islands. I was just following orders. My father lunged at her, his face contorted with rage, only to be restrained by one of the officers. You, ungrateful little, he spat. Everything I gave you, everything I risked for you. Their perfect facade had crumbled completely. revealing the ugly truth beneath. There had never been love between them, only greed and convenience. As they were led away in handcuffs, I felt no satisfaction, only a profound sadness for what could have been for the family that had been destroyed by selfishness and betrayal. In the following weeks, the full extent of my father's crimes came to light. He and Sandra had been systematically draining company accounts for over 2 years, hiding the money in offshore accounts under false names. The private investigator my mother had hired had documented not only their affair, but their financial crimes as well. She had given this evidence to the authorities with instructions to act after her death, ensuring that justice would be served without her having to witness it. The legal proceedings were lengthy and painful. Sandra ultimately agreed to testify against my father, in exchange for a reduced sentence. She received 5 years for her role in the scheme. My father, unrepentant to the end, was sentenced to 15 years for fraud, tax evasion, and embezzlement. All their ill-gotten assets were seized, and the company my father had built, now tainted by scandal, was transferred to me as per my mother's wishes. The aftermath left me shattered in many ways. I had lost both parents, one to cancer and one to greed. The company needed extensive restructuring to recover from the damage my father had done, and I was left to pick up the pieces of a life that no longer resembled anything I recognized. The first few months were the hardest. I would wake up in the middle of the night overwhelmed by grief and anger. I moved out of the family home, unable to bear the memories it contained. I threw myself into work, taking control of the company and implementing rigorous new financial controls. But inside I was hollow. It was Father Thomas who suggested I see a therapist. She helped me understand that my grief was complicated by betrayal, that my anger was justified but could not be allowed to consume me. Slowly, session by session, I began to process everything that had happened. I also found unexpected support from some of my mother's former colleagues and students. They shared stories I had never heard before, illuminating new facets of the remarkable woman who had raised me. Through their memories, I kept discovering new reasons to admire her strength and foresight. 6 months after my father's conviction, I made a decision that changed the course of my healing. I established the Elizabeth Parker Foundation for Cancer Research, dedicating a significant portion of my inheritance to funding treatments for underserved patients. The foundation also offers counseling services for families affected by cancer, recognizing that the disease impacts not just the patient, but everyone who loves them. Through the foundation, I met others who had experienced loss and betrayal, though perhaps not as dramatically as I had. We formed a support network, helping each other navigate the complex emotions that come with such experiences. Some of these people became my closest friends, understanding parts of me that others simply could not. As the 1-year anniversary of my mother's death approached, I visited her grave alone. I brought her favorite flowers, white lilies, and spent an hour talking to her, as if she could hear me. I told her about the foundation, about the changes I had made to the company, about the slow process of rebuilding my life. And I thanked her for protecting me, for loving me enough to ensure I would be okay even when she was gone. The truth always comes to light, she had told me with her final breath, and she had been right. Not just about my father's betrayal, but about the power of love to transcend even death. My mother had loved me enough to plan for my future, to shield me from financial ruin, to ensure justice would be served. That was a love that could never be diminished, not by cancer, not by betrayal, not even by death itself. As I walked away from her grave that day, I felt something shift inside me. The anger that had been my constant companion began to loosen its grip. Not because my father deserved forgiveness, but because I deserved peace. I would never reconcile with him, never visit him in prison or respond to his letters, but I would no longer allow his actions to poison my future. In the years since, I have rebuilt my life on my own terms. The company is thriving under new ethical leadership. The foundation has helped hundreds of families facing cancer, and I have learned to trust again, carefully and selectively, but genuinely. I carry my mother with me in everything I do, guided by the values she instilled in me. I often wonder what I would do if confronted with the kind of betrayal my father committed. Would I recognize the warning signs earlier? Would I have the courage to confront it head on? I hope I would, But the truth is, we never really know how we will react until we are tested. All we can do is try to live according to our deepest values, and trust that as my mother believed, the truth will eventually come to light. Whenever I face difficult decisions or moral dilemmas, I ask myself what would make my mother proud. That question has become my ethical compass, guiding me through the storms of life, with the same quiet wisdom she always demonstrated. And in that way, she continues to protect and nurture me, her love, extending far beyond the grave. If there is one lesson I have learned from this painful journey, it is that true love, the kind my mother had for me, never really dies. It transforms us, strengthens us, and continues to guide us long after the person who loved us is gone. That is the legacy Elizabeth Parker left behind. Not bitterness or revenge, but enduring love and the courage to stand for what is right. What about you? Have you ever experienced betrayal from someone you trusted completely? How did you find the strength to move forward? Share your story in the comments below, and do not forget to like and subscribe to hear more true stories of resilience and justice. Thank you for listening, and remember, sometimes the greatest strength comes after our most painful losses.